See the, can you see these slides okay? Oh, sorry, I can't see my chat. Just here we go.
It looks wonderful, Mike.
Okay, good
And
sizing and all that.
thank you for joining us to present on the InvenioRDM GitHub Archiver.
I think I wanted to copy paste the slide address and I forgot to copy it in my buffer. So I'll put it in afterwards. There's not very many, so I'll just put it in the chat after, or maybe Tom, if you can find it because you know where they are. Right, so when the Caltech library switched to InvenioRD, oh, sorry, my name is Mike Hucka. I'm at the Caltech library. I'm a research software developer. And we have at the library used for a long time an institutional repository. Previously we used Tind, now we switched to InvenioRDM. And this is where people at the institution at Caltech can upload and archive software releases and data releases. And so Tom can tell you all about that because he's the one who set it up and is managing all that. One of the things we lost when we went to InvenioRDM because it wasn't available yet in InvenioRDM is some kind of automation that would allow people to make it so that when they release software or data or anything in GitHub, it would get archived and deposited in InvenioRDM automatically. And so Tom had the idea that I started down a different path, but then Tom had the idea that it might be simplest to make a system that works on GitHub itself using GitHub Actions. And so that led to the creation of InvenioRDM GitHub Archiver, or IGA, which is what I'm going to describe next. So I'm just going to give you a brief outline here. I'll talk about IGA, give you a short demo, give you some more details, and then leave you with some URLs to find out more. So the goal of IGA is just to make it as easy as possible for people to put records into InvenioRDM, create records and upload assets and just archive stuff in InvenioRDM. As you know, it's often difficult to convince people that they should archive their things in an institutional repository. So the easier we make it, the more likely it is that people will do that. And so IGM has this goal of making it as simple as possible, like automate as much as possible of the process. Its main features, so it's primarily a command line tool, and then it has a GitHub action that uses the command line tool to automate things. So you don't actually have to use the command line tool if you don't want to. You can just use the GitHub action if that's what you prefer. In fact, you can invoke it manually from the GitHub action, but it's sort of this two-faceted thing. It creates, what it does basically is to create a record in InvenioRDM from GitHub releases. And it does that by contacting GitHub. You provide information about the release you want to archive, and it contacts GitHub via the GitHub API to get information about the release, the repository, user data. It also gets the code meta file and the citation.cf, actually, and the citation CFF file, if there are any in the repository. It works really hard to extract as much information as possible from that, maybe too hard in some cases. And then it also gets the assets from GitHub, assets meaning the binary, let's say the zip file of the source code release that GitHub creates. Possibly also, if you want the, let's say you have binary versions of some software that you've created and you've attached them to the release in GitHub, it can get those as well and upload them to the record in InvenioRDM. It also supports InvenioRDM versions, so you can link the releases of your software, updates of your software, to sort of the revision history in InvenioRDM. And InvenioRDM has this notion of communities, which are sort of like collections of things, thematically related collections of things. And IGA can support that as well. And it's written in Python. So let me give you a short demo of what this is about. So I'm going to switch and share a different screen. Oops, this is a bit difficult because of how I placed my windows. I think it's this one. Can you see text in a window? Man, why does that always happen?
Yep.
The chat window keeps disappearing every time I switch the sharing. Sorry. Okay, great. Thank you. So this is a command line I'm running on my Mac OS computer here. I've already installed IGA. I won't go through the installation process, but basically you use pip or pipx or whatever method you want to install it. And once you install it, you have a command called IGA, and it does all the good things that command line tools should do, such as provide help. So if you type IGA help, you get a quite extensive bit of information about the usage of the tool, and a command line summary at the end. And there's also, I'll give you the link, but there's a pretty extensive documentation site for IGA as well. And basically, once you install it, in order to use it, you need to provide it with information about the destination InvenioRDM server. You also need a personal access token, which is something that the InvenioRDM server provides for you to use in software so that it's authorized to deposit things in the InvenioRDM server. If you've used GitHub, anytime if you've used GitHub personal access tokens, it's the same idea. It's basically just a token. You get that from the server, from the InvenioRDM server. And then optionally, sometimes you don't need it, depends on how much you're trying to archive, a similar token from GitHub. Normally, I would recommend to put those in environment variables, and the documentation says which environment variables to set prior to running IGA. You put that in. You can also pass them on the command line, and here in this command line summary, you could see some of the flags that you can pass on the command line to provide the information about the InvenioRDM destination server and the token. I'm not going to do that here in this demo. I've set the environment variables for you, for myself, so I don't have to type all that in. So if you don't have to type that in, the simplest case is you just copy the URL of a release in GitHub and pass it as the argument to IGA. And so I just now switched between windows. I have a browser window open to a test release in GitHub. I just copied the URL from the release, pasted it in, and you type return and let it go. And once it's running, it tells you what it's doing. It summarizes what it's doing. And basically, you can see here what it's doing is it's building a record. And this is the part where it's contacting GitHub to get information and also get the code meta file if there is one, a citation CFF file if there is one. It uploads a preliminary record to the InvenioRDM server. That lets it get from the server a URL to which, for the new record, that's the InvenioRDM server created, and it uses that URL to attach the assets, which in this case are just a zip file of the release. It gets the asset from GitHub, downloads it, and then uploads it to the InvenioRDM server. And then finally, it gives you the URL of the new record. It can create, so InvenioRDM can create DOIs for your new record. So if it doesn't immediately do that, or sorry, IGA won't print that on the command line. You might not need it, but if you did, there's another flag basically that you tell it, yes, give me the DOI that's been created. So if you run IGA with that flag, you get you get 2 lines at the end. So you get not only the URL for the record, but also the DOI of the record. Okay. And so I'm just going to show you what it's, well, actually, I'm going to show you a different, because this test is just a very bare bones test, so I could just do the demo. Let me show you what a sort of a typical record might look like. I'm going to switch on again. Sorry for the switcheroo. This is this one. Yes. So this is an example record in Caltech data that was created using IGA and the automation. And yeah, so you can kind of see the sort of thing that you get out of this. So you get title, the authors, contributors, copyright holder, a citation description. The description is pulled from the GitHub release description, the files. So in this case, all it did, because all this release, by default, all it does is just uploads the source code, but you can tell it to upload everything. So that's why there's this one file. And then there's additional description, some technical information, and it constructs metadata. So for example, IGA will extract and create entries for things like, oh, this is pretty small, isn't it? Sorry about that. Text is probably a little small. It creates URL links to various things for that it can extract from either the code meta file or the citation file or the GitHub repo itself. And then this is the version history. I mentioned that you can have IGA basically interact with InvenioRDM to provide the trail, connect up the records so that there's this version trail. Okay, so that's hopefully pretty straightforward. I'm going to switch back to my presentation, and here it is. And so I'm just going to pause real quick if there's any sort of immediate clarification that anybody would like.
I'd like to just see if you could address who are the target audience for this.
Aha, thank you. That's a good question. So basically anyone who is, ideally anyone who would be users of an institutional repository who are developers or let's say people who use GitHub at an institution that uses InvenioRDM. So Tom can answer this more thoroughly about who all is currently using InvenioRDM. I think Zenodo, who's the creator, is switching to the team that created Zenodo is switching this. So I think Zenodo also will become a user of this. But basically, if your institution uses InvenioRDM, there's a few, and you wanted to provide, so whoever's the InvenioRDM maintainers, if you wanted to provide people the ability to automate uploading things from GitHub to InvenioRDM, those would be the users. You could also, because it's a command line program and can archive anything basically that you point it at in GitHub, let's say the people who are the repository maintainers at an institution like Caltech, you could have people do it for other people. So the librarians at Caltech could, in theory, or the people who are administrators for a research group at Caltech could be the ones that do the archiving on behalf of people who develop software or data or do research in their group, because you can have, you can sort of have a designated person who does the uploading. That kind of answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So more details about what it's doing under the hood. So I mentioned it gathers data from GitHub. So what it's doing is when you run it, basically grabs metadata that's available via the GitHub API. There's not as much metadata available that way as one would hope. So it looks for the code meta JSON file and citation CFF file if they exist in the repository and gets them from GitHub as well. Those are much richer in their metadata for creating records. And it creates a record based on that information. There's a set of fields that an InvenioRDM record has, and it basically just goes down the list of these records, constructs them, uses the values from code meta, CFF file in GitHub. In some cases, it may be useful, depending on how much information is provided in CodeMeta, what information is provided. It may look up identifiers. So if it's necessary, it might contact orchid.org and get information about users. It might contact PubMed to get information about a reference if there's a DOI provided. It might contact ROR to get information about institutional or organizations that are mentioned in the metadata, etc. So it has a bunch of things that it's able to get information from other services depending on what it needs. It sends the record to the InvenioRDM server, gets an upload URL from that server so that it can upload the GitHub access or assets. And then it submits to the RDM community the final record and the assets, or it publishes. You can also have it just create a draft record and let's see, where's that responding? And you can also have it save it locally. So let me just quickly show you a demo of this. If you wanted, another thing you could do is, instead of having IGA send it to InvenioRDM, you could have it save the record that it builds as a file on your local directory, and then you could just view it as it's a JSON file. So you could just view it and you could look at all the information that's gathered and possibly use that as a source for something else. I don't know, because it's gathered, a fair amount of information that it's parsed out from these different sources. And so this is a test case, so there's a little bit sparse, but you could see that. And you could also tell IGA not to get information from GitHub, but rather to use a JSON file you created for the record. So another workflow you could do is basically take IGA, create a local record, edit it to your content, and then upload that new edited record. So there's a number of things you could do like that. A question you might have is, how does it create all these records, and how does it gather this information? And particularly maybe relevant to SciCodes is this: how is it interpreting the information from CodeMeta and CFF? And so you had to kind of, in order to do this, to create the InvenioRDM records and to map the data, metadata that InvenioRDM expects and the ways that it expects it to the code, the thing you can get from GitHub or CodeMeta or CFF. I had to create kind of a crosswalk for this purpose. There's a detailed summary in a spreadsheet in Google Sheets. I'm not going to go there now, but I'm just going to tell you that the slides have a link, and then in the documentation for IGA, there's a link to that. The basic approach is for fields in the InvenioRDM record that there can only be one value. Basically, except with a couple of exceptions, it will take the single value preferentially from CodeMeta. If it can't find it, it'll take it from CFF, and if it can't find it there, it looks in GitHub. Most fields, they take multiple values, so it basically takes the union of things it finds in CodeMeta and CFF and GitHub, because it can add multiple values to that field in InvenioRDM. Okay, so again, there's a pretty detailed explanation of which fields it takes from the different sources and how it combines them to produce the final record in the thing it creates. So I mentioned some of this in passing. You can have additional features, not by default, but if you wanted, just command line flags or through the GitHub action, is you can you can upload all the assets. You can also give it local files. Let's say you have data files in your local repository that you want to upload, or you're constructing your own metadata record that you're sending to Invenio. You're not actually using GitHub. You're just creating your own record that you can send to an InvenioRDM server, and you want to provide binary or other files, and you can tell IGA to upload specific files from your local repository. You can also modify how much information how it combines the information from the different sources. I mentioned that it preferentially takes code meta, followed by CFF, followed by GitHub. But if you want, you could tell it to be even more inclusive and just use all of the information it gathers. That can be useful for the list of contributors on a repository in GitHub if that list of contributors is not mentioned in code meta. But we can talk about that. There's pluses and minuses about doing things like that. And I showed you a quick demo of how you can save the record to a file instead of sending it to RDM. And you can also not have IGA build it. You can take a record and send that explicitly. You can create draft records in InvenioRDM instead of publishing it directly. And then there's extensive documentation. As I showed at the beginning, if you do IGA --help, it'll print a lot of help text. And then all of these things that I just mentioned, the different special features, are controlled by flags in the IGA. So you just pass those as flags. You kind of saw that you saw me doing that in cases there. There's no limitations about this, so it tries hard to get information from code meta and citation CFF. However, although this code meta standards explain how you should format the information for a valid code meta, I have found that code meta files in the wild don't often follow the actual specification and the standard. So possibly because code meta has changed, and so maybe what people what people have used refers to older ways of writing code meta files. But anyway, it's turned out that a lot of things that you wish people would do in their code meta file, they don't do, and instead they just do things like write text strings instead of having structured information in a field. So if that happens, particularly in the funder information and funding IDs, that's been a particularly hard one for IGA to get, because people sometimes will just write free text in a text string, and IGA I just can't parse that stuff, right? I just can't figure out which number in a text string is the funder as an agency number or an agency identifier versus a grant number versus who knows what. So it's not always able to get the funder and funding IDs, but it tries, but it just can't always. Another thing that's a real problem is if the code meta file, if there's no code meta file and there's no citation CFF file, or if you give it the flag to get everything from GitHub, GitHub's name field is a free text string. Basically, it doesn't break down names into family name and given name. However, InvenioRDM currently requires that split. And so in certain situations, IGA is forced to try to figure out whether name string is which part is first name, which part is the last name, which is very bad because some people don't have first last names. Some cultural standards are that you have one name and it's legitimate. And and also sometimes people write names in different ways. So it's if IGA has to try to split a name into first name, last name, it's not always able to do that. It uses machine learning techniques to try to do it. We just can't. Sometimes it's just impossible. And then lastly is again, InvenioRDM wants to know whether a contributor or a name on a field is the name of an organization or a name of a person. It's typically in code meta and citation CFF, you identify that, but not if if IGA has to get it from GitHub itself, that's another thing that's not very accurate in GitHub. So again, IGA tries way hard to do that, but it can't always do that because it's just really not possible to get it right every time. So those are some known limitations. Okay, so in conclusion, I'll just leave you with some links, and I just realized I didn't show a demo of the the GitHub action for IGA. I could do that, or we could just skip and go to questions. So tell me, sorry, let me just go back to that. Tell me if you would like the a GitHub action demo, or if this is enough.
Let's see, do we have any questions?
Thanks for answering that. It is possible to search in GitHub. It's possible to search for code meta JSON. The GitHub search facility lets you search for code meta JSON file and citation CFF files. So I did that a lot, trying to figure out what it is that people actually write in their code meta files. And for various, so this is one reason actually I don't use one of the I ended up not using a parser for code meta and citation CFF. IGA just uses a custom JSON parser so that it's really robust against errors, even syntactic errors in code meta JSON files. So it's really trying to make it robust, because remember at the beginning I said we're trying to make this as easy as possible for users to use, so that they will actually go to the trouble of doing something to archive their releases in the institutional repository. So making this tool as automated and robust as possible, and not having it throw up errors if the user has handwritten their code meta file and forgot a comma or something. That was a really important goal. So it has to do with kind of really low level parsing and try to be really robust against those things. I see there's a couple of.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks. This is such a cool tool. Thank you for sharing it and building it. I see that Invenio is part of the name of the tool, but how easy or feasible would it be to target other institutional repositories that are non-Invenio?
So I would say, so that was not a goal of this. So the simplest way, however, would be if you use IGA to just create the record based on the data it gathers, and then output the JSON file locally, and then you could feed that to a translator of some kind for another institutional repository format. So that would be the simplest way to do that. The algorithm for constructing the record is sort of modular in the Python, in the sense that every field in the InvenioRDM record, just like, I don't know, 20-ish, maybe 30 fields, is a function in the Python code. So, and hopefully it's readable, because I knew people might want to read and see what it's doing, so I try to make the code readable. You could possibly take those and adapt that part of it, the metadata extractor, to construct another tool. The part that interacts with Invenio, the module of the code, is another set of functions in the Python code. And of course, those have to be really specific to InvenioRDM, because the API has to interact with the API and very specific things. But the transition point between those two things, the constructing of the record and talking to Invenio, is also like a breakpoint in the code. So you could, I haven't tried it, so can't guarantee that's easy, but you should be able to just write another module in the code that, instead of Invenio, it talks to another tool and just uses that transition, that breakpoint in the code between creating the metadata and talking to the destination server. Okay, so I think it's not impossible. I haven't tried it, so I can't guarantee it. The one thing I would say, I suppose, is that InvenioRDM wants particular information, which in some cases is really general information, but in other cases it's a little bit specific, like getting the information about whether something, like the name, spelling the names, for example. That's really kind of an InvenioRDM thing, versus getting organization versus human. That's an InvenioRDM thing. So another destination server might not need those, but the code that generates the metadata extracts those anyway. So I guess you could maybe not use that information if you're trying to write an adapter or a module that writes to another destination. But hopefully the metadata is pretty complete, so you could take and pick and choose what you use for the server or the other destination.
Hervé, last question.
Yes, just a question. I was wondering if you had tried to extract contributor ORCIDs from their GitHub profile, because it could solve a few problems, including finding the names of the contributors, for instance.
Yeah, so there's no explicit. So hold on, let me modify that. Let me just check what I actually did. So it has the ability to extract that information from an ORCID identifier. I think the issue is that in GitHub, it wasn't, when I looked and wrote this code, when I looked at the GitHub API for user records, when I looked at it, ORCID was not explicitly broken out as a field. I know that GitHub now allows you to provide arbitrary links in the profiles to other things. So that's a good question. If I can find, so that it could do that if if there's a way in the GitHub API to actually figure out which URL, how to get the ORCID, but that's a good idea, and I could definitely, I'd be interested in doing that. So let me make a note to check that. Let's see.
Yeah, I was wondering whether I should investigate that myself for other projects. I know that now you can list different social network profiles in your GitHub profile. So I assume that just parsing these URLs and finding one starting with orchid.org could be a good way to find the ORCID of the contributor. Obviously, you know, it won't be efficient unless there's a good adoption of GitHub users actually using this to link to their ORCID profile, and I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's so like I said, they added the ability to have, it used to be that you can only have Twitter links, and then they made it so you can have other social media. And so so that's a good idea. I'll check to see whether we can get that from the GitHub profile. It should be, you're right that, I mean, otherwise the code is there to get that information from ORCID, from the public ORCID file goes orchid.org. You can query and get the public information as JSON from, if a person chose to make that information public in ORCID, which is another question. But yeah, you could do that. So
okay, thanks a lot. Great presentation.
Thank you so much, Mike. Really enjoyed the presentation.